Welcome to the virtual FinTech Fair, where we are going to look at AI in financial services. And to discuss this with me, I have the absolute pleasure of having a regulator, and that too an award-winning one, to talk about this. It's not every day that I have the pleasure of having a fireside chat with an award-winning regulator. So without further ado, let's welcome our expert for today, Dr. Wanpracha from the Bank of Thailand. I'll do a very quick introduction and then I'll request him to add a little more about himself. So Dr. Wanpracha is the Senior Director and the Head of Data Management at Analytics at the Bank of Thailand, which is the Central Bank of Thailand. And apart from heading this particular division, he also holds 3 patents. And of course, needless to say, he is an expert in this space. So let's turn it over to Dr. Wanpracha. Perhaps you can introduce yourself to our audience, and then we'll jump into the questions.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Malik, for a very kind introduction. I am responsible for data, ranging from data acquisition, data management, and data usage in terms of data analytics. So we started this data analytics program about 4 or 5 years ago. And we realized that we need to look at data as a commodity, as a pipeline of Bank of Thailand resources. So my department oversees the data pipeline, from how the data come in and how it's being stored, how it's being secure, how it's being processed, and how it's being used in the Bank of Thailand. So we provide end-to-end services to economists, supervisors, regulators within the Bank of Thailand. So that would be my role.
Thank you, Dr. Wanpracha. So obviously you are like a key nerve center for the entire organization. And with that, let me jump in straight away to something that many of us are curious and keen to hear about, which is your award-winning AI system that your team and you developed with a focus on natural language processing. So please tell us, how did you go about developing it and deploying it, and what are its tangible benefits for BOT?
Sure. Yes, last year we were honored, very pleased to receive an award from the from Central Banking Magazine for the AI initiative. The awards recognize 3 projects that we overtook over the past 3 or 4 years that I mentioned. One of which is natural language processing, where we look at board meeting minutes from financial institution. The idea is to assess behavior and culture of, in terms of governance of financial institution. For example, if you have human who do the reading of board meeting minutes to see what board members talk about a financial institution, what their concerns, how they respond to regulators like us, how they pursue their strategy, and so on and so forth, right? If you use human, different supervisors at different times might use qualitative judgment, right? So you want something to have a standard that with a good quantitative measure, so that you can look at the language, you can look at the topics, you can look at participation of board members, and you can measure them in a way that is systematic and it's consistent. And you could imagine we oversee 30-something financial institutions and board meeting minutes, and you can see there are 100 pages, and you have to do it every month. And again, you have to use the same measurement, right? You have to use the same ruler, if you will, the same measuring tape every time. So it's impossible for human to do it manually. So we analyzed over 50,000 pages of board meeting minutes. So we developed an AI system, a natural language processing system, where we identify topics that were discussed during the board meeting. We identify board members. We use technique called name entity extraction, where we know who's who, to look at their participation and participation level, and look at different groups. The timing of each individual topics are being appropriate for discussion, and how they respond to requests by the BOT, for example. If you have concern, how do they take our concern? So all in all, you could imagine you use this AI across the board, all financial institutions in all different towns. So it helps us definitely go back in time and do the, we can quantify, we can assess how different topics, how contribution of board members and so on and so forth. And once you have that, you can actually visualize it. You can, draw up a dashboard, for example, as opposed to have a stack of papers, right? So you can translate that into reports, something that we can monitor, if you will. So that's one of the 3 projects that helped us got the award. The other 2 was a little bit of NLP, where we look at the government spending for the public sector. So we receive data projects from the government, and we have to identify the code of like what kind of spending it is based on IMF standards, right? So in the past, we just have manually people look at the projects and identify the economic code and usage code and whatnot. So we just, now using text analytics and have them, put in the right category. So we reduced from 3 days of work into 3 hours. So that's helped us get there. The other project was not on NLP, but it was more on the banknote defect detection. So detection is easy, but prognosis of it is what's difficult. So the printing machine already detect the error, but to identify the root cause of the errors is more important. So we help develop AI on top of that. Once it being banknotes being detected to have error, to be defective, we identify the root cause, help them identify what processes that could go wrong, and you can intervene in the process, and you can kind of save a lot of hours of human labor. So those are the 3 projects that we've done over the past few years, and last year we were lucky enough to be recognized for these efforts.
Thank you, Dr. Wanpracha. Fascinating. All 3 projects are not just fascinating, but they are like classical textbook applications of machine learning, and it's really interesting to see how you've applied ML across 3 different use cases, but with perhaps common objectives and common successes. So I'll come back on the NLP project, not just because it's your award-winning project, but for folks who are in this space and for experts in this space, we know that NLP is particularly hard both to develop and implement, especially when you are talking about prognosis, sentiment analysis, etc. And in your case, you said you are also using it to kind of get a sense of director participation, etc. But we've also seen that it's easier said than done. There are many nuances around dialects. In the case of specific countries, I don't know how applicable it is in the case of Thailand, but in Singapore, we have Singaporean English or Singlish, or in the Philippines, where I currently am, it's a combination of Tagalog and English or Taglish. So it's a whole new dictionary which doesn't exist in the classical Oxford dictionary, or even things like messaging platforms and how we use emojis, etc. So my question is, how did your team and you go about maybe working around these challenges, and how did you make your system more accurate and more useful?
Right. In our case, we have more challenges. At the same time, we pick the data where it's not too, I would say, messy, like social network chats and whatnot, right? So we have things that are easier and things that are harder. So I'll start with things that are harder in our case. Thai language has no spacing. You could imagine, right? Let's say if you use English or Singlish and whatnot, you have spacing between words. In Thai language, we don't have any spacing. So first thing first, we have to identify individual words. So we have to, figure it out. Is this one word or two words? Are these together? Are these not together? So that, as a prerequisite before we start modeling the meaning of it or the semantic of it, of the words. So I think that's a difficult part because if you put two words together, it could mean two different things, like two individual words versus one word together. In Thai, it happens a lot. So we use neural networks to identify. So we have a set of dictionary where we identify these are common words that people will talk about. We're not perfect. I think we can do it maybe 99% and whatnot. There's some exception, but we hope it wouldn't change the context of it. But like I said, imagine we talk about hundreds of pages of minutes, right? If you miss one word, probably be okay. But for different applications, that could be difficult. So those are the things that we find much more difficult in Thai language in our case. We fine tune, we retrain our own library, if you will. We base on our framework on Google, Tesseract. There's a framework out there by Google that's very nice. And a lot of, for the OCR part, for the semantic part, but you can retrain. These are open sources. So we don't build things from scratch, right? So we built based on, there's a lot of open sources out there that are available and great, but the main thing is you can't really use it out of the box. You have to kind of train it to the right context, right? So in our case, we take millions of news feeds from business and economics news to help understand the wordings, the language that we use in our space, right? So at the Bank of Thailand, we look at economy, we look at businesses, we look at finance. So we kind of wrap ourselves around these words and what they mean, right? So that's how we attack those space. Now, we actually recently extend our work to social media, but in terms of social media, we look at news, online, Facebook pages, not individual Facebook. We try to look at sentiment of comment, but again, because of emoji and so on and so forth, we're not going to be 100%, but we can kind of get the sentiment is positive or negative from that. But we haven't really got into the meaning of individual comments. I don't think we're there yet, and not our intention in terms of as an organization, right? But of course, if you're a startup or you develop businesses, you want to understand what comments means and what it would entail, right? You need to take action. Yeah, I think that's a different story, and that will be much more difficult. For us, there are things that are more difficult, and there are things that we kind of limit ourselves to the space where we don't deal with things that are quite messy, like you said, emoji and all these slang and all these what it means and whatnot. So we try to look at the individual data, micro comments and whatnot, but we look at a macro level as opposed to action, that would take at each individual comment and whatnot.
Thank you, Dr. Wanpracha. So there were two key takeaways that I kind of distilled from this. One is open source, so you don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel. There is a lot of opportunity, whether it's Google or IBM or many others who give you cloud-based solutions. So might as well, leverage those. But at the same time, you have to train and retrain them as you want in your specific context. So coming to that, Dr. Wanpracha, one of the big challenges we see, and again, if you had to put this in a very classical contextual theoretical model, we say on the one hand, it's the system and its computing power, but also the quantity and quality of data. And you know, for us in data sciences, we talk about the 3 V's of data, right? Yeah. So my question is, one of the big challenges of any AI or ML system is GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And as you said, while in your case, the garbage in challenge is much lesser because you deal with annual reports and a lot of much more, perhaps cleaner, robust data. Yet data governance is one of the biggest challenges in organizations, and especially multi-stakeholder organizations. I won't use the term complex organizations, but as you said, you deal with many divisions, you deal with regulators, you perhaps deal with you know, folks who are on the treasury side or the reserves management side, multiple stakeholders within the organization and even outside the organization. You said 30 odd financial institutions that you deal with. Perhaps shed some light on your data governance practices and what could be the 1 or 2 best practices that our audience could take away from this.
Right. I have to confess, in the past, my department, like I said, oversees data, but we had a different department who laid out data governance. So we do the day-to-day operations, and we had a special department that helped draw up the governance policy, right, and to set up data governance council with the deputy governors and some assistant governors to take the stance on where we want to be. Okay. Again, data governance is just a framework, but first thing first, like you said, we need to have a stance on ultimately what do we want with our data, right? What's our stance on the data, right? Do we want it to be open? Do we want to promote the usage and whatnot? Luckily, so we have had a good relationship with that department, and now that department is merged with mine. So, you know, because we have the framework, we have a good understanding within the whole bank, right? So we did that a few years ago because data governance was new, right? It came around with GDPR, with all of these data privacy, data governance that came around 4 or 5 years ago. So we had a separate department, if you will, to kind of get the stance and educate people. Now that people are being educated, understand things now, we can operate it easily under the framework. Just to give you an idea first, people have to understand the role, whether or not they data owner or data controller, whatever you want to use the word for, who's going to be administrator of the data, who's going to help oversee, take care of your data, and who's going to be the user of the data, right? So once you understand your role, right, like I said, you have the stance, then when we talk about the data themselves, you have to understand data classification, right? So as a data controller or data owner, you know how sensitive or how secretive, you know, data sets that you have in your hand, right? And you have to understand how you want them to be treated for the entire life cycle of your data, right? So when you put these things together into one gigantic organization like Bank of Thailand, so now how do you really try to make standouts of it, right? My department is the central data administrator of the Bank of Thailand. So most of economics and financial data we oversee, right? We administrate the data, but we're not the owner of the data. We're not the controller of the data. So we have to work with the department or the group. Let's say if you have supervision group, they're the owner of the data that of the data collected from financial institution. So they have to work with us and help. We help them design. They have to make the ultimate decision of how these data sets, again, these individual data sets that they're the controller for, be handled. Okay, who can have access to their data? So we have to act on their behalf. Again, when there are things, when there are requests that out of the guideline, we have to be the liaison between the users and the controller, right? So these will make things a little bit easier if you have a central data administrator. How do you do data governance? Again, we haven't talked about the IT part, the support in terms of data leak prevention and so on and so forth, right? But we're just talking about the operational level. Some organization, if they choose not to have a central data administrator, I think things can be a bit tricky. It could be messy, right? Because you could do things different at different standards, right? Let's say you want to request for the data, how do you do it? Different data controller might have different stance on okay, how difficult you want it to be. You want it to be painful, or you want it to be easy. But one thing that the Bank of Thailand we try to push really hard is the data reuse, which in Europe has been part of the national strategy. For example, the Bank of Thailand, we have set up a subcommittee where when someone at the Bank of Thailand or some department at the Bank of Thailand want to collect new data from financial institution, we want to make sure that we make the best use of such data. Not only does the person who initiate the data collection benefit from the data, but also everyone else in the Bank of Thailand, but most people, if we can find. So that would be make the best use of the data. So imagine you start cooking, you want to make sure everyone in the family can enjoy the meal. That sort of, our stance. So in terms of data governance, we tend to be more open, of course, but for secret data, PII, personal identification data, we would just leave it to the data controller, but by default, you don't see any names. But you can request for it, but we try to make it open to have access to the data. But of course, we make sure that it's secure and it's safe.
Thank you, Dr. Wanpracha. And I think one key takeaway for me and our audience here is know your role and have very clear identification of whether you are an administrator, whether you are the owner, whether you are the user, or some other entity in the whole chain. And I kind of frame it as a professor, I kind of frame it to my students in the 7P model of process, people, platform, priority, privacy, etc. And I would love to go on more on this topic because you obviously come with a wealth of knowledge in a fairly complex organization on how to govern data. But I want to, in the interest of time, jump to a slightly more macro question and a macro topic, something which, when you utter the term AI, this really concerns a lot of people. And I think it came about in a very subliminal way when you were talking about your NLP project. All the three projects that you articulated and highlighted were talking about automation or significant automation of repetitive processes. And we know that that's the start point of any ML system. So clearly there is both within BOT and within the larger ecosystem. This means that quite a few roles get redundated as a result of this kind of automation. And if I may put this in context, a couple of years back, there was a study by IDC and Microsoft which indicated that up to 2/3 of current jobs won't even exist in a decade. Now you could, one could argue and agree or disagree whether it should be 2/3 or 60% or 50%, or whether it's 10 years or 15 years. But the broader theme here is that automation is not just killing jobs, it is also changing the nature of jobs and roles. And one stated objective of any central bank in the world is usually maximum employment. And towards this extent, they usually deploy monetary policy from their toolkit on monetary supply, interest rates, etc. Now I know that this is not directly under your division or office, but I do want to perhaps get your view as somebody who's leading this within the organization. Clearly, you must be interfacing with the people in the monetary board or others who kind of take care of this policy. Now suddenly they are faced with a whole new challenge, which is how do you look at employment not just from a monetary policy lens, but from a hyper automation lens as well. And as we've seen, in fact, this has gotten very, very significantly accelerated during and after the pandemic, not just in Thailand, but all over the developing world. So considering that you are in a central bank, does this worry you and the central bank, or do you, as an expert of this and as a thinker of this space, do you see this as a logical, natural extension the way the first, second, and third industrial revolutions came about, and it will just change the nature of our jobs?
Oh, Malik, these are great comments. I can wear three or four different hats to give you an answers. First hat in my previous life, I was professor as well. So when I was teaching the topic, of course, students came to me and asked all of these questions like, okay, I study all these, and what do I do after I graduate? Will still have my job. So these are the things that people are concerned. Even though the maximum employment is not part of our mandate as a Bank of Thailand, but of course, employment is a key, and it's all tanked up with different economic conditions. I think I'll give you the best answers from my perspective as professor. Then, I don't think we should worry about the workforce of the future. I believe that these automation and AI can only work based on things that we already know, things that human can teach, like data garbage in, garbage out. And then the question is who select or who decide which data are good or bad. It's human still. So, these I would call AI, these machinery, right? It's efficient. It can think a little bit, but it can think in a way that we teach them to think. Human can switch up our work to do things with higher cognitive functions, and then many other things that require higher cognitive ability that human can develop, whereas a machine still cannot. I mean, in the future, yes, there might be, it could be Google, Facebook, or other tech companies that could develop super intelligence machinery, but again, it's going to be not going to be everywhere. It's going to be localized. It's going to be a very few tech companies that can achieve that. But if you look around the world, it's not going to go everywhere. There's other part of the world that still need these cognitive abilities, and again, it cannot solve all the problems in the world. So I'm not too concerned. I think the key takeaway, these are the things that I always teach my students. You have to understand the machinery. You have to understand its limitation and its usage, and you have to understand there are opportunities, there are gaps, like different evolution and revolution, like you said, the third, the fourth, and the fifth, and whatnot. There are always opportunities for the future work. And the rise of the machineries and technologies, there come different problems. Even AI now, if you look at the AI or machine learning literature, it started in the 70s, 60s, and whatnot until it became, realization. And now you talk about fairness, you talk about ethics. People realize that AI is, as a black box. You have to make sure that it's fair. So the question is, who decides who's fair or not fair? Who decided? It's still human to think about. Well, let's say if you do lending, let's say the bank do the lending using AI machine to do the lending, you want to make sure you give a fair opportunity for people with different background. Otherwise, you're going to be biased toward I don't know, in the US, it could be a white male or whatnot, right? You want to make sure it's fair for underrepresented group, make sure you give a fair share of opportunities. Or even, you know, with technology, with the usage of computer, then you have to think about green, you have to think about sustainabilities, you know. So all these things come from human with the higher, you know, cognition that we have, ethicals and all different perspectives that we can put in to govern the AI world. So I'm not too concerned, but for people who have oversight or who govern the AI world, you need a good understanding of what they are. I think that is key.
Thank you, Dr. Wanpracha. You've covered a lot of themes and topics in a single response. And I would have loved to carry on about AI ethics. I think both of us as professors are very passionate, and we challenge our students to think about it. You've touched upon the black box challenges and perhaps the challenges of AI bias, etc. I would have loved to carry on, but the clock is ticking. And I've just been prompted. So I think we can conclude our discussion here. We've had a broad look at what AI is, how it has been implemented in your organization, and how it can, you know, what are some of the best practices, both in terms of application as well as data governance, and also the challenges. I'm glad we touched upon the challenges because, you know, it's pointless to conclude a discussion of this caliber on just a note that everything is fine and the world will become great. Of course, there are challenges. And as you said, at the end of the day, the responsibility really lies with us humans, because the machine learns from data and it learns from models that we humans build, data that we humans provide. So at the end of the day, I think while we talk about AI black box, a large part of the ethical responsibility lies with the governance in organizations or in regulators or for us as individuals as well, and to be more cognizant of our data privacy as well as data sovereignty. On that note, it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Dr. Wanpracha. And ladies and gentlemen, this very enlightening fireside chat was brought to you by VFF and our Global Impact FinTech, or the GIFT Forum, which is one of the largest, most diverse and most inclusive FinTech nonprofit think tanks globally. We have members and leaders from 65 countries, and we always try and engage in a dialogue with policymakers and regulators so that we can address some of the most important questions of the day, and not just from a commercial standpoint, but also from a socio-cultural and inclusion standpoint as well. And it's been an absolute delight to have this conversation with Dr. Wanpracha. Thank you. And Mushir, over to you.
All right, thank you.